Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zapansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. On August 26, 1997, the half-naked body of prostitute Heather Hernandez, 20, was found in an empty lot in Spokane, Washington. The same day, the decomposed corpse of prostitute Jennifer Joseph, 16, was discovered in an alfalfa field. Both women had been shot in the head. The day after Christmas, 4 more women were found with plastic bags tied over their heads, the gruesome signature of a killer who had sexually violated each one of them after they had died. And then there were more victims. When the killer is finally arrested, it turns out to be a devoted husband, a father of 5, a National Guard helicopter pilot, and a Desert Storm veteran. Not since the Green River Killer had the Pacific Northwest been so terrified by so savage a serial killer. Robert Lee Yates Jr. confesses to 15 murders. My guest is Edgar award-winning author Burl discussing Body Count, the terrifying true story of the Spokane Serial Killer. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview this evening, Burl.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and for your future information, the town is called Spokane.
Spokane. Thank you very much for correcting me on that.
It looks like it's Spokane, but it's actually pronounced Spokane. A lovely town in eastern Washington. And, I almost didn't write the book. There were about 13 other authors vying to do the story of Robert Lee Yates. And actually, there was another book called Murder in Spokane by Mark Furman, which I've never met Mr. Furman, but allow me to say the book is totally inaccurate. I thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, that was going to be my first question, because I thought that was very intriguing that normally a publisher, Pinnacle, the true crime imprint of Kensington Press, had approached you rather than you approached them. And you said it was because you were familiar with the social and cultural makeup of the locales and your personal interaction with one or more of the principal characters central to the story. And yet you said you were hesitant to write this book. Now, why were you hesitant to write this book, and explain the social and cultural makeup of the area in which this incredible story takes place?
Well, his very first victims, it turns out, were actually friends of my family. This goes back to Walla Walla, Washington, which is a sleepy town of about, officially 25,000. It's actually more than that. It's in the southeastern Washington tip. And Patrick Oliver, 21, and Susan Savage, 22, grew up together in Walla Walla, Washington. They've been friends since childhood. They were both well-known people in the community. And the Oliver family and my family knew each other, and it's a close-knit town. And back in '75, on July 13th, they went out for picnics. Said they'd be home in time for dinner, and they didn't come back. Their bodies were found in a recreational area 10 miles east of Walla Walla, in an area called Mill Creek, near a place called the Wickersham Bridge. It was a favorite outing spot for the Olivers. They were both found murdered, their bodies under an old tire and an old sleeping bag. The murder was never found. It wasn't until years later, 25, 30 years later, when Yates confessed that murder was cleared up as well. They were friends of my family. In fact, his brother, years later, long before the Spokane serial killer became well known, was a frequent guest in my home. And so there was a connection there. And then one of the murder victims, Darla, who is mentioned, and her boyfriend Arthur. Arthur and I became friends in Seattle when he was managing an apartment building. He moved back to Spokane, and I had friends and relatives in Spokane. My family went there for Bloomsday. My son ran in the Bloomsday Marathon race. And on that day, I stopped by to visit Arthur, and his then current girlfriend, Darla, dropped by, a very attractive young lady, wearing very short cut-off jeans and obviously no underpants. And she proceeded to relate the fact that she just robbed somebody of $600. I said, Darla, what are you talking about? Turns out Darla was, almost Freudian slip there, Dollar and Darla. She was what we call in the polite vernacular a $20 whore. She worked the streets. But she happened to meet a very polite gentleman, traveling salesman, who offered her $600 to spend the weekend with him in the finest hotel in Spokane, and he would do that, I believe, twice a month, regular as clockwork. She would be safe, she'd be well fed, she'd be with a safe person, and like many people in that lifestyle, unable to look at the big picture, she took the first $600 and ran. And I said to her, Darla, let me give you a piece of advice. This is how women in your line of work get disfigured or, at worst, killed. Because men who are doing that are very emotionally sensitive. You may never remember him, but I guarantee you, he will never forget you. And you do that to the wrong person, you're going to wind up dead. The next time I saw Darla, it was photographs of her dead, decomposed body at the dump site where she was murdered and left by Robert Lee Yates.
Wow. Incredible connection. I had no idea. I knew you're from the area, but this is amazing.
I lived in the same city with him in Walla Walla. My daughter went to the same school with him. I knew two of his victims I had met personally. Another one was a graduate of my same high school, although much older than I. So I was familiar with not only the cities, but the people. And Arthur, may his soul rest in peace, he died he had a stroke and a heart attack or whatever. He helped me with actually the writing of the book, put me in touch with a lot of the people I interviewed. And he gave me an extensive interviews for the book about Darla. He actually saw Yates come and pick her up on their final date. Her body was found wearing his Mickey Mouse sweatshirt that he had lent her that day.
Wow.
So I knew these people. And it was because I knew the people, I had interacted, that despite there were other authors who wanted to do the book, the publisher said, hey, you're obviously the guy.
Right. Now, what was the community like? You say it's a little sleepy little place, but what is Spokane like?
Well, Spokane is a bigger city than Walla Walla.
Right.
He was living in. He originally wasn't from Walla Walla. He was originally from, I believe, Oak Harbor, which is not too far from Mukilteo, where I was also living at the time I signed the contract to write the book. He was working in Walla Walla, Washington, ironically, as a prison guard, correctional officer. In fact, in the book, there's a photograph of Robert Lee Yates taken, his employee photo. They take the employee photo and the convict photos in the same place, just like the booking photos.
Yeah.
There's two photos of him in the book. One is his employee photo from the 1970s when he was there as a correctional officer, and then the photo of him as a prisoner in the 1990s after he was, found and confessed. So he wound up right back where he was before.
Ironic. Let's go back. You do, early on in the book, go back to Robert Yates, his life, his early life growing up. What were his parents like? Obviously, everybody wants to know what the upbringing and the life, so they can either draw some conclusions from that or not. But tell us about his early life growing up.
Okay. Now, he actually came from a wonderful family. He had great parents, and a lot of people see, gee, can I blame myself? Was I a bad father? One thing and another. In the hometown of Oak Harbor, Washington, they don't call him Robert Lee Yates. They call him Bobby to differentiate himself from his father. Interestingly enough, in 1945, his grandmother, wielding a double-edged axe, violently ended her husband's life. Yates' father, I have a quote here, says, I was there, I heard the murder in the night. He found his father near death and his mother seated in a straight-back chair in another room. She had given birth to 11 children, been under the stress of having a husband working away from home, and she simply broke. She spent 7 years in a state mental hospital, according to Yates Sr. Now, according to those who knew Robert Yates Jr., the convicted Spokane serial killer, this was a kid who was never in trouble. He was always practicing his upbringing. It was a good one. His upbringing was idyllic, healthy, moral, exemplary. He was, as far as everyone knew, he was nothing but a good kid. What do you do in the Olympic Mountains by the Pacific Ocean? Backpacking, hunting, dirtback riding, fishing. Wholesome activities up there are the rule, not the exception for a life on Whidbey Island. His father was an elder in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It was a tiny congregation, less than 100 people. This is a close-knit family, good people. Nothing at all that would give you any indication that this kid had something wrong with him. You don't get any indication until the time of his first marriage. He was married twice.
Now, before that, you can talk about a little bit about his military career, because I end up talking about him being a National Guard helicopter pilot and serving in Desert Storm. When did this all occur? Did this occur after? Give us
it occurred after the first murder. The first murder was in Walla Walla, Washington. It was after that he goes into the service.
How old is he when he does that, Burl?
Oh boy, I'd have to look up the age, but
is he a young man?
At the age of 20 is his first marriage. He married Shirley Nylander. They moved to College Place, where he enrolled in Walla Walla College, which is College Place is like a suburb of Walla Walla. It's a Seventh-day Adventist school.
Okay.
18 months after the marriage, she moved out, went home and asked for a divorce. He didn't give her an argument. In 1974, he gets married to Linda Brewer, who was a student at Walla Walla Community College. But his 1974 marriage to Linda was illegal and annulled because his divorce from his first wife wasn't final. 6 months after the invalid ceremony, they did get married. So, but he went into the service, and there is this suspicion that many unsolved murders in Germany, where he was stationed for a while, he may have been associated with. There's nothing to really, back that up.
Right. No, so is there any indication did you have a chance to speak to his first wife at all? Was there any information?
No, well, there was, one of the problems with that is that when he was there in College Place, there was a slight problem that he was renting out the apartment next door. There was an apartment next door, and he drilled a hole in the wall to watch his neighbors have sex. Now, everyone needs a hobby, but that's not usually considered socially appropriate. No. So that was a bit of a problem. But like I say, he went off. He was in the service. Then the only trouble he got in there was having done a little shooting from the helicopter to shoot a buffalo or whatever that they cooked up for dinner, which was an authorized use of military equipment. But right. As far as his military record, no, he was... this guy, even after arrested, they said, this guy's going to be a model prisoner. He knows how to follow orders. He was a hard-working guy. Nothing lazy about this man. He was not afraid of hard work at all. The work he was doing in Spokane was very difficult and demanding work. And he, like I say, he had 5 kids who loved him and a wife who was putting up with all sorts of nonsense. He was going through a lot of money. He lied and broke down and cried and told her he had a gambling problem, which wasn't the case. What his addiction was prostitutes and illegal stimulants.
Now, you make a point of talking about the area where the serial killer was hunting, and this is East Sprague, if I'm not
East Sprague,
incorrect.
Yes.
And so
right.
This is the strip where the prostitutes, the most vulnerable prostitutes that you may not get out of a phone book at an escort service, these ones are on the street plying their trade.
Right. Now, if you read the book, and people have been reading it, it was re-released again, last year, which I'm very happy to say, and it's been selling well again. I always like that.
That's great. That's great.
I did a lot of research, and there's so many myths and misunderstandings about prostitution in America. Just ask yourself a simple question. If you wanted a rentable sex partner, where's the safest place to get one? Is where it's legal. You go to Nevada, you go to Pahrump, you go to the Mustang Ranch, you know there's not going to be any problems. You're not going to get a disease. No one's going to rob you, right? And the girls are safe. When it's illegal, all bets are off. The majority of working girls, as they're called, or working women, or working men for that matter, are not on the street. That is the minority. Most of them also are not on drugs. That's also a myth. The majority of them work privately or they work through services. They're clean. If they were dishonest and rip-off artists, they'd be fired. But you have a small segment of women who, for one reason or another, and I really try to get into this in this book to show that these are real people with real families who have had things happen to them that have put them in this situation, and they're highly vulnerable. And one of the real, I've got to give a lot of credit to Spokane Police Department, Spokane Homicide Department. They did something brilliant and so admirable. They went out to these women working the street, and they went out to the pimps, they went out to the drug dealers, and they said, listen, drugs, sex, okay, maybe some of it's misdemeanors, some of it's felonies. Murder is an entirely different issue entirely. We don't care what you're selling. We don't care what sex you're having. Someone's killing people here, you know?
Right.
This is all we care about. I don't care what drugs you got in your pocket. I don't care how many hookers you got working for you. We don't want anybody getting killed. Here's my phone number. You can talk to me. I'm not going to arrest you. When I say I'm not going to arrest you today, sometimes cops will pull that nonsense. I'm not going to arrest you today. What they mean is they're going to come back tomorrow. But these guys were smart. They knew there was a killer on the loose. They wanted to save lives. And so they built bonds of trust with these working girls and the guys and the dealers. I mean, you had a strange alliance going on here. You had the police and the prostitutes and the drug dealers working together to try to catch this killer. And this was something that wasn't happening in Pierce County, in the Tacoma area, where this guy was also committing murders. They weren't that far-sighted. They couldn't think out of the box that way. But Spokane, thank God, did, where they were talking to people. They would go right into the drug houses. They, don't worry, we're not going to arrest you. We don't care what you got. We're trying to catch a killer. And that makes all the difference in the world. The girls knew they could talk to the police. The drug dealers knew they could talk to the police, about this killer and not have it affect anything else.
Yeah, I think it's admirable that you do point that out, and it's a very admirable effort by the police force to actually genuinely reach out to those people that might really help them. And that was another question.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, these are people that don't want to talk to the police. If what you do for a living is tragically illegal, the last person you're going to talk to is a police officer, all right? So they had to gain their trust and say, listen, I don't care. I'm a homicide detective, I'm not even taking notes on what drugs you're selling. We're trying to catch a killer here. You've got girls working the street. We want them to come back. We don't want them dead,
Right. Now, getting back to this hunt for this particular person, obviously when I introduced this story that he ends up confessing to 15 murders, so we're just at a few here. You talk very much and very highly, and it looks like you obviously had good access to the task force itself or the investigation itself. Now, tell us a little bit about the contact with FBI. What, if any, help was the profiling that's normally done in a case like this?
It wasn't. There wasn't. It was such a mess. I felt so sorry for these guys. You have a homicide task force in the city of Spokane. Spokane is much bigger than Walla Walla, but it's essentially a small town of limited resources. They put together a task force of the Spokane Police Department and some representatives from the Washington State Patrol. It's underfunded, right? Eventually, they did get some financial reimbursement from, I think, the federal government. But they're working on a limited budget, limited resources. They become somewhat of a political football. And also you had another gentleman, a fairly well-known personality, who had a radio show in town, who was continually talking about the case, getting the public riled up with a lot of misinformation, a lot of false leads, picking on the homicide task force, and making their life difficult. When I showed up to do the book, and I met with the homicide task force, usually when I go to meet with the homicide task force, which has successfully solved a case, they're very happy to see me, right?
Right.
Not in this situation. They're looking at me sideways the minute I walk in the door, because there had just been a book. The other book that was written by another author, called Murder in Spokane, was originally written as an indictment of the homicide task force for being so lousy and not having solved the case.
Wow. Okay.
And just before the book was about to come out, they solved the case. And the author went to them and said, please tell me how you did it. Please give me access for information. And they said, I won't give you the exact wording, but basically came down to, listen, you're a convicted felon. You've done nothing but make life difficult for us with the stuff you've said on the air, and you can go do an interesting trick that defies the laws of nature. We've got nothing to do with you.
Yeah, right.
Then I show up, and for all they know, I'm like him.
Sure.
And they wanted me even to sign some sort of an agreement with them that if I did this wrong or that wrong, I mean, it was very, very... I had to prove myself to them.
How'd you do that?
By
show them some of your books?
my books, my reputation,
sure.
And I met with them repeatedly, and about what my attitude was. And bless their hearts, they were still working on a deal, even though Yates had confessed. There was a plea deal made between two different prosecutors, one in Spokane and the one in Pierce County. And that was if he would plead guilty and if he would tell them where one of the missing bodies was, that they'd take the death penalty off the table. And then the Pierce County prosecutor reneged on the deal. So then there was going to be a trial in Pierce County. And so things got kind of messy then in terms of my book was actually held up for almost a year because I couldn't get the photographs. And even the photographs in the book aren't that great as far as true crime book photographs go, because they were going to be used in evidence in a trial.
Right.
And also, I think it was partially so that they could stay in control. I think they had been, dare I say it, in their opinion, really screwed over by this other author, and as cooperative they were. And I really must say that Cal Walker of the Spokane Homicide Task Force and the other guys were, all things considered, absolutely fantastic to me, considering what they had been through and how angry they were with this other author, that they were wonderful to me, especially Cal.
Why did Pierce County renege on the plea agreement that
you have
Spokane...
got me on that one. I don't know. They pulled a rabbit out of a hat somewhere, and even then, I don't know if he'll ever actually be executed, because if you don't execute Gary Ridgway, the confessed Green River killer, which is a lot more bodies,
sure,
how do you execute this guy?
You do make a point in your book, though. If the victims of any say in this, they weren't interested in the death penalty.
No, they weren't really.
Usually that has some bearing on the situation, doesn't it?
Well, now that's a whole other issue on victim impact statements. And
well, not maybe so officially, but when you do have sort of a majority of people that do not want the death penalty, I think it may be a factor, even though it's an emotional one.
Yeah, it can be. In fact, and I'm glad you mentioned this, because it allows me to give a plug for my forthcoming book, which doesn't come out till January, which is called Fatal Beauty, where there's an entire section devoted to this very concept and the arguments over whether or not there even should be such a thing as victim impact statements when it comes to the outcome of something like that, which is a very highly debated issue.
Interesting.
But it's, to me, one of the fascinating things that the Homicide Task Force ran into on this situation was public apathy.
Really?
And this drove them nuts because Yates learned his lesson on that first killing. The first people he killed were well-known, well-respected young people in the city of Walla Walla. And it was headline news, front news, rewards offered, etc. Well, he got the hell out of town. And he learned a few things. One is you don't shoot someone in the head with a .357 Magnum when their head's in your lap. Two, you use a low-caliber weapon. And if you're going to kill people, kill disposable people. People that other people don't care about, supposedly. Meaning the hooker on Sprague, the streetwalker, like they're not real. Well, they are real people, and that's something I really wanted to get across in my book. These were women that had moms and dads, and they had children that they're supporting. Somehow people get the idea that these aren't real people. Like one of them, his name escapes me, there's so many of them, had worked for years in the local hospitals, at a reputable job. And her sister was a teacher, and they were very, very close. And she developed severe carpal tunnel syndrome and had the operation on her wrist. She couldn't work. She was on pain pills. She couldn't continue her job, winds up being addicted to the pain pills. Then she doesn't have any medical insurance coverage, no health care. And when you've got high medical expenses and a kid to take care of and you can't work and you're a woman, there's always something you can do.
Well, it's another debate, but I certainly agree with you that prostitution should be legalized in order to protect people at the level that everyone else expects to be protected by the police. And
it's not even a matter of legalization. If you talk to them, they don't want it legalized. They want it decriminalized. And here is the interesting reason which most people never think of. And that is, if it's illegal or legal, is no difference because it's still controlled by the politicians and the police.
Certainly. Those people would still be,
Those
people would still be looking for a job outside of the establishment, we'll say.
Yeah, but if it's decriminalized, if they're unionized, if they have the same protection. I mean, the fact that a woman can be beaten to a pulp and can't go to the police and she says, "What were you doing?" "Well, I'm a prostitute." "Well, serves you right. What do you expect?" You wouldn't get that in any other job. I work at the 7-Eleven. I got beat to a pulp. What do you expect working in a convenience store? No one would dare say that to you.
No, but Burl, just not to argue the point, but at the same time, you've covered a lot of cases. You've written about a lot of murder trials and murder victims. There is good victims, and there are, as you say, less important victims. It seems to the public. The public seems to think that certain.
That's the real key to the public. And what Cal Walker, the Homicide Task Force, said. There are people who believe as long as he's killing prostitutes, we're safe because he's not going to come kill us. That these people are our buffer. As long as he's killing these girls on the street. And here's another thing. Could these women go to shelters? Could they go anywhere to be safe? Right? No. Because up until a certain point, in order for a woman to go to a shelter, she had to be drug-free.
Okay.
If she wasn't drug-free, they wouldn't take her in. So what you're doing is you're just putting the most vulnerable people. I mean, the police didn't want to use the term prostitutes or drug addicts. They'd always preferred the term people of high-risk lifestyle.
Sure.
And is just putting them out there like bait for this guy. He knew who to get. He knew he could get away with killing easier. It's like that guy up in Canada who bumped off, 80 women or something, and the prostitutes themselves were going to the police saying, someone's killing us. So how do you know they just didn't leave town?
Sure, yeah. He had 50 for sure.
Yeah, and this is really, and the thing is that the women that Yates was killing, these 13, all knew each other. They all ran in the same little crew. They were all, with the exception of a couple of them, were fairly scandalous. The little Asian girl that was killed, who actually the button off of her blouse was the damning evidence found in the Corvette. She wasn't into drugs, and she became a prostitute on some of her vacation because she liked the job and she liked the lifestyle. Everybody needs a hobby.
She's only 16 years old too, so it's many people would think that wasn't really an adult decision. They have a little bit more sympathy for us.
But it's the strangest thing is some people certainly have different mindsets. She wasn't a drug addict. She told her dad, she was very honest, says, I like the sex, I like the travel, I like the lifestyle, and I'll be back in school in September. I mean, sure. Everybody's got their, and people thought at first, the police said, well, maybe it was her boyfriend, maybe, nope. He was as devastated as anybody, because it wasn't him. What was tragic is this guy was driving a white Corvette, and he was stopped, and purely through a legibility error, the officer wrote, instead of Corvette, wrote, I believe, Corvair. And it slipped through the cracks. It wasn't until years later. And by then he'd sold the car. But they did find the car, and even though the car had been sold and cleaned up, underneath the seat, they found the button, the missing button, and they found the DNA of that Asian girl,
Jennifer Joseph.
Yeah.
And so from there,
it was as if she came back from the grave to catch her killer. It was just like some out of a movie.
Interesting. Now, how long did this manhunt approximately go for?
Years. And that was one of the problems. Is that, they had trouble getting funding because they hadn't caught the guy. Everything was going to dead ends. There was one point where they really thought they had a lead because the tire tracks next to that they got tire bowls from, one of the dump sites.
Right.
And they found the exact same brand of tire molds. Again, thank God, man, we got it. And they ran the tests. You know what it was?
It was their own officers.
Cop cars. Their own cop cars.
Yeah.
And then it reached a point where they had a meeting one day in the Homicide Task Force. They all sat down, and they thought, maybe it's one of us. Maybe it's one of the guys in this room. And so they took DNA and everything from all the guys on the Homicide Task Force.
Incredible.
And it wasn't them. Because it was just, these guys were on the verge of just, breakdowns over this. Because they're living it. And it's just one after another. Then there'll be periods of silence, and there'll be, 2 in 1 week. Sure. And they had people that they thought it was that they're following, and they're getting DNA from, and it's not them,
Yeah, I found it interesting. You had so many. You devoted so much of the book to the exhaustive leads that these guys pursued. They had different descriptions of vehicles. They had all kinds of leads that they pursued to the very end conclusion, and you could see that. Certainly, they had a lot of pressure to solve this case, but they had to take every lead seriously and then, to its final conclusion, exhaust that lead and then eliminate that suspect. So it was an incredible story about the details of the investigation itself.
And as you know, and this is something that makes me nuts watching Nancy Grace, which I do occasionally, or listen to the Levi Pages show, and I wrote about this on In Cold Blog, the #1 crime blog site, and I had Aaron Moriarty on my show, and we talked about this. I call it water cooler crime. You know, if there's an investigation in process, right?
Right.
Whether it's a missing kid or a killer on the loose, to sit around and pontificate on who you think did it is such a waste of time,
of course,
except for ratings. Because if it's an investigation in progress, the police are not releasing the important information.
Sure.
Because the important information is what's going to help them catch the killer, and they don't want the killer to know they have that information. So
Certainly.
anything that they release for Nancy to talk about, or Levi to talk about, or you and I to talk about around the water cooler is useless.
Sure.
And so for people to sit around for an hour and, well, I think so-and-so did it, I think so-and-so did it, that's when you have the situation of that poor guy who killed himself after some talk show accused him of being a child killer, and he had nothing to do with it.
Sure.
You know, and then you got to wonder, what's the culpability of media and that sort of thing. I was on one of those shows, and they asked me about Kaylee Anthony or something, and I said the same thing I just said to you. You know, if it's an investigation in process, in progress, and still looking for it, you know, I don't have the information to talk about it. And if I did, I wouldn't, because then the killer would hear it. You know, let's be rational here. Let's take care of something we can do something about, you know?
Well, the thing is, I think the thing is, though, that authors like yourself that are investigative journalists take this information, have sat through trials, and actually, at the end of doing all your research and being involved completely, you actually understand how a trial is conducted and understand the process more completely than anyone else that's just superficially looking at the news. And I find that a lot of these pundits on TV, because they got to do stuff all the time, they don't specialize, they really don't understand the law. And them speculating is, you know, I don't listen to it too often because it's kind of ridiculous, because you can't really, like you say, you can't have any more information than it's already been released. So to speculate who did what or how they looked on TV or...
The thing that scares me, I'll tell you, and this does scare me, I'm not just saying it scares me for the sake of hyperbole, is the people who are so eager to say the minute someone's arrested or someone's charged, they're just saying string him up, kill him, hang him, you know, chop his testicles off, whatever. The guy, woman, whatever, hasn't even been to court yet. They could be innocent. And just because someone's arrested doesn't mean they're guilty. And this thing of assumption of guilt, and I mean, where is a person supposed to get a fair trial anymore? It's difficult enough. And here's something that most people never think of. And this may surprise you. One of the purposes, this is never discussed, you'll love this. One of the purposes of having registered sex offenders is so you've got someone to hang a case on when you can't solve it.
That's your opinion, right?
That's a fact. I could name you a case, but someone might sue me. I don't know. There is a case where there is a man in prison right now for life who it is known by the detectives and by a very well-known forensic, whatchamacallit, my mind just went blank, worked on the case, that the guy didn't do it. And I said to a detective in the city, because I followed the case I went to, and I said, according to the police, because this man was a registered sex offender, and you immediately suspected him, you had him under surveillance 24/7 from this date on. Is that correct? He said, yes. I said, it was also testified in court that the body of this child was moved on such and such a date approximately to this other location before it was found. And his eyes just kind of averted. And I said, you know what I'm saying? He couldn't have done it, because if he had done it, you would have seen it. And his response was, well, at least we cleared the case. So I followed up on that, and I went to the medical expert who had examined the body and spoke to him. And he said, the child wasn't strangled. the child wasn't molested. Everything medical about the child was indicative that the kid had been crying. The mother tried to silence the child with her hand over the kid's mouth and accidentally suffocated her child. Not able to deal with that, she dumps the kid and reports that someone horrible did something to the kid, and where is it?
Well, the police didn't, obviously, the person you spoke to didn't have all the information.
Well, so you will also get in a situation where it's tragic for people to stop and think about, because there are so many wonderful police people out there and so many wonderful homicide investigators, that you can get in situations where you have political pressure, you have social pressure, you've got a really good, viable candidate to have done the job, and if you can close the case, you can close the case. I'll give an example. I know we're talking about body count, but I'll mention I have a book called Murder in the Family, where they successfully prosecuted Kirby D. Anthony for the horrifying rape and murder of his own aunt and her two lovely little children. This is a terrifying case. The man's a monster, in my opinion. It's a tragic story. They almost didn't pursue him because upstairs in the same building was a fellow of the approximate age range who was a previous who was a listed sex offender, and they were ready to go gung-ho after this guy, and he lived right upstairs. The only thing that stopped him was they did have an FBI profiler involved, Judson Ray, who was involved, who said, no, he fits everything that you're looking for, except whoever did this, because of the way the people were strangled, knew them intimately. And this guy, even though he lived upstairs, he did not know them intimately. If they would have focused all their attention on that guy, the real killer would have got away.
Well, certainly you also have those kinds of cases as well, too, where you have a organized serial killer who, very much like Yates here, doesn't have any criminal background. And when the police are looking for the suspects and they're weeding through a list of suspects, because they don't have a criminal record, because they don't fit any kind of profile, they're the last people in the investigation.
You've hit on something really on the button there, and this is the tragic thing. When you're dealing with these kind of serial killers, they're the last person you'd ever think of. When it went on TV that Robert Lee Yates was arrested and had confessed to being the serial killer, one of the women who knew him was sitting in a restaurant, and she saw him on TV. She about broke into tears. She knew him. In fact, she liked him so much, she had fallen in love with him.
Oh, wow.
Even had taken him home to meet her family. She was a working lady. But she thought he was so wonderful. And then there was the woman who was the survivor, who did not know that she had survived him until after he was arrested.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
He had picked up this particular young lady. He dated almost every working girl in Spokane, from what I understood. He didn't kill all of them, as you notice. Right?
Sure.
But he was dating her, and it was always the same thing. She was performing oral sex on him, but he wasn't responding. Well, all of a sudden, she thinks that he's smashed her over the head with something. All of a sudden, she's got bang, he hits her in the head.
Sure.
And so she gets up and he wants his money back, and she says, no, I was doing what I was hired to do, and he's furious, and she runs away. Well, about 3 months later, she's in a car accident on the other side of the state and goes to the hospital. They do x-rays, and the doctor says to her, are you aware of the fact you have bullet fragments in your skull? And she goes, what? And apparently, you see, what he would do is, and I don't know how sensitive your audience is to this sort of thing, but if they're listening to this kind of program, they're not too sensitive.
Sure.
The woman will be performing oral sex on him, and if after 7 minutes he didn't respond, he would pull out a low-caliber weapon, 22, 23, 24, whatever it was, and in his right hand, hand and place it directly behind what would be her left ear and pull the trigger. Well, apparently this young lady zigged when he thought she was going to zag, and the bullet, instead of going into her skull, grazed it. Well, of course, it hurt. She thought she'd been hit in the head, and she went away. So the bullet did not penetrate her skull, but it's fractured. There were bullet fragments in her head. Well, when she saw his picture on TV, she realized that was the guy who hit me in the head. My God, he didn't hit me. He shot me.
Incredible.
But she didn't realize she was shot until later.
So she goes to court, and that ballistic evidence, that bullet fragment matches with the other crimes.
Yeah, he would just say, he didn't kill her, but she certainly had a headache.
Certainly. So she had her comeuppance at court.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's in prison, and and there were people I knew. There was one woman I interviewed who's in the book that she was on the street in Spokane. She was a heroin addict. She got clean, and then she fell back off the wagon. So, a lot of these people were only working the street when they had to. There was a subtext in my book that you'll notice there is, towards the end, there's a statement in my book that makes no sense. I don't know if you've come across it, but the statement where I say, and similar to the Linder case, and there's no reference to the Linder case in the book. So you might, what the world is Mr. Bear talking about the Linder case?
Right.
That was an editing error. They took out from the book an entire subtext of my book, because I guess they took it distracted from the story. I thought it was important. In whenever the Harrison Act was passed, Harrison Act was what 1919, something like that. Harrison Act was a tax act, a $1 a year wholesale tax act on drug distributors.
Okay.
And people were afraid at that time that it was going to interfere with them getting their drugs. And that time there was no link between drugs and crime in America. And most of the drug addicts in America were Southern white women, actually, taking over-the-counter medications that had, addictive substances in them.
Sure.
And if you did have a drug addiction, you simply, much like in England, you just went to your doctor, and your doctor gave you what you needed. All the Harrison Act was a $1 a year wholesale tax to make sure that distributors, the people were actually writing prescriptions. Well, in Spokane, Washington, the same city, there was a Dr. Linder. The collection of the revenue of the Harrison Act was given to the Department of Revenue. They sent a woman to Dr. Linder who said, my regular doctor is out of town. I'm going through withdrawals. I need some morphine and I need some cocaine. So he legally wrote her a prescription for 3 morphine tablets and 3 cocaine tablets, had her take one in the office, and had her space them out until her regular doctor was back in town.
Okay.
Next thing he knows, he's arrested. And he is charged with some crime of giving these drugs. He loses because the judge tells the jury, if you were to find that Dr. Linder prescribed these medications to relieve the pain of someone with stomach cancer, that's okay. But if you decide that he gave those medications to alleviate the pain of her withdrawals, you must find him guilty. He was found guilty. He appealed it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he won. The United States Supreme Court ruled that the federal government has no right to interfere in the doctor's treatment of a patient and has no right to say what a reasonable amount of addictive medication is, and that he was perfectly within his medical right to alleviate the pain and suffering of an addict by giving the addict, what they needed. The climate at that time was such that doctors were still afraid to do that. And so the doctors stopped treating their addicts when it was cheap. And so who moved in to do it for them? Organized crime.
Certainly.
Up until then, there had never been a link between crime and drugs in America. Well, Dr. Lindstrom was the medical examiner in Spokane at the time of this case, and he was arrested for an alleged impropriety with drug prescriptions. And so that's why I referenced the Linder case. Had it not been for the fallout of the Linder case, you would not even have the subculture of street prostitutes and illegal drugs that made his victims possible.
Certainly. Yeah, I can understand that subtext, certainly, yeah.
And they took all that out except the one reference to Dr. Linder, one of the most overlooked Supreme Court decisions in American history. It's a very famous case, Linder versus United States, or U.S. versus Linder. In any event, that was also in Spokane, Washington. It's very tragic. If we did not have I had on my show the guy who was head of law enforcement against prohibition. And as he said, if you just took all Schedule I drugs in America and made them Schedule II, the problem would be solved. You write a prescription, you get it, you're done, they're cheap. Organized crime is out of it. The crime is out of it. But what you have is there's more money in corruption. If there weren't so much money in corruption, it wouldn't still be the way it is.
I think the thing is that sometimes there's a combination of things. It's politically, it would be a huge football to try to roll back drug laws or actually scale them back. Even to talk about lifting mandatory minimums is politically suicidal sometimes. But I do agree with you. The only way to solve the problem, it might seem absurd to some people, but many people that have been involved with this, police, law enforcement people have said, you have to legalize all drugs. You have to take organized crime out of it.
Because, like I say, what age do you have to be to buy alcohol where you are?
18 years of age.
Jersey? How old do you have to be to buy cocaine?
Sure, any age.
Any age.
Yeah.
Who's in charge of the quality?
Yeah.
The mob. Who's in charge of distribution? The mob. But it's not that way in other countries, and they don't have those problems. Like I say, in America didn't have the linkage between drugs and crime until the 1920s when it became illegal. It's just like Prohibition. Prohibition didn't work with Al Capone, and it doesn't work with these guys either. It's just that the corruption is so profitable. I had Norm Stamper, former chief of police of Seattle, on, and he'll be the first to tell you. He says it's a waste of police resources. It causes nothing but corruption, and you wouldn't have these. I'm happy to say, however, when Robert Lee Yates, the Spokane Killer, was captured, prior to that, they did, thank God, establish a shelter for women where they could go, where they didn't have to be clean and sober in order to get in. Because otherwise, they were just sitting ducks for him. They were just out there, like fish in a barrel.
Certainly.
They didn't have anywhere to go. The minute he was captured, they wanted to close it. Fortunately, I think it was Volunteers for America came in and kept it open.
Oh, that's good. That's a very good thing. Now, you talked about Yates confessing to 15 murders. What was the deal? You said the plea bargain was given up, but in the end, were 15 murders solved? Were the bodies identified?
The real tragedy was, and this is in the book, and poor Cal Walker of the Spokane Homicide Task Force, his stomach just sank with this. They said, well, we're looking for the one, we haven't found the body. I try to remember what her name is. It's at the very, very end of the book. And he says, okay, I'll draw you a map, to where the body is.
Right.
And where the body was at his home, buried under the bedroom window. And they had torn that place apart. They'd had dogs. They'd had everything. He had brought her home as the ultimate trophy and buried her under his bedroom window.
Incredible.
And so when they started following him in the car to find out where he took that body, and Cal Walker told me, when I realized we were going back to his house, he said, I just got sick to my stomach. He says, how could we miss that? And
certainly.
There she was. I mean, it's just really, really distressing. One thing they never did find out, they never asked him, and they never told him. I was thinking about this just the other day, of writing him a letter and asking him. When he would shoot these women, after the first time when he made the big mistake of using a .357, right, is he'd shoot him and he'd immediately put a paper towel over the wound.
Right.
And then he'd put these paper bags over. They never could find where the paper towels came from.
Yeah, I found that interesting that that was part of their investigation. They tried to track down the origin of those paper towels.
Where's the paper towels? They figured if I buying them near the house or something, what brand of paper towel? They never could find out what the hell kind of, pardon my language, what kind of paper towel it was. And they never did bother to ask, of course, once he confessed. I was thinking about it the other day, because, he's sitting there in Walla Walla, right? I'm like, what kind of paper towels were those?
Incredible. Even the plastic bags, they did an exhaustive investigation on where those bags might be and did some geographical sort of profiling to say this might be where he could have operated.
And they were
from.
even able to finally take prints or DNA or whatever is off the bags.
That was incredible.
I felt so sorry for his wife. Can you imagine how devastated that woman was? She was, having pie in a restaurant. And they came and, talked to her and says, about your husband. And they said, oh, God, if he's in trouble, I'll kill him. And when they told her,
he's in trouble.
Yeah, they didn't want to come and take him away, in front of the kids and everything.
I know that you talk about the father supporting him despite the crimes, but basically, what was his demeanor in court? We only got about 3 minutes left, but what was Yates like in court? Yates the killer. It was like he was angry when he kept saying, he'd read the people's names. Linda Maben, I'm sorry. Darla so-and-so, I'm sorry. It's like he wasn't sorry at all. But of course, if the guy is a psychopath, they don't have the emotion. They're missing the emotion chip. Sure.
And most of them can cry on cue, because that's the one thing they can do. But they really are incapable of feeling remorse. You can get mad at them for killing, but you can't get mad at them for not feeling remorse. They're incapable.
No, I agree with you too, because they always ask, well, geez, did the guy show any remorse? Well, if he showed any remorse, it would be disingenuous anyway, or advised by his lawyer. So I don't really put too much stock in somebody showing remorse.
It was the only one I know of, Caitlin Rother, who's a wonderful person, a wonderful author, wrote the book Body Parts, which came out.
She's on next week. She's on next week talking about that book.
Yeah, give her my best regards, and she'll tell you, here's a guy who walks into a police station and says, I'm a serial killer. There's a guy with remorse. He turns himself in.
Well, I know somebody that turned himself in, but there was no remorse, so, that's not always an indication either. So.
Well, at least the guy knew he was doing something wrong. It was like Brent Turvey says, why do they do it? It's simple. They tried it, they liked it, they did it again. Same reason you go to the same Chinese restaurant. You try it, you like it, you do it again. Once you cross that line between fantasy and doing it, you can't go back. You may fantasize about, doing something sick. Once you've done it, you've done it. And when it comes to murder, there's no way you can take it back. You've killed once. What difference does it make if you do it again?
Sure. Well, we just got a few seconds left. We were talking about the book Body Count, the terrifying true story of the Spokane Serial Killer. Burl, tell our audience how they can contact you. You have a great radio show on your website. Tell our audience about when that is live. And
real easy. If you go to Outlaw Crime, all one word, outlawcrime.com, and you'll always get the news of who my guests are. I got Amanda Lamb coming up this Saturday. I'm going to have you on in a couple weeks. That'll be fun.
Yeah,
Caitlin, we have all the best people, including you. So if you go to outlawcrime.com or Burl, BurlBarer.net, you can always get a hold of me. And great, thanks so much for having me on the show. It really went by fast.
Well, thank you very much. I know our audience appreciate it, and it was a great pleasure for me to have you on the show, Burl. Thank you very much for this interview.
Okay, thanks. Say hi to Caitlin for me next week.
I will, and you have yourself a very good evening, Burl.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Okay, take care. Bye. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, with your host, Dan Zupansky. Good night.
the big picture. She took the first $600 and ran. And I said to her, Darla, let me give you a piece of advice. This is how women in your line of work get disfigured or, at worst, killed. Because men who are doing that are very emotionally sensitive. You may never remember him, but I guarantee you, he will never forget you. And you do that to the wrong person, you're going to wind up dead. The next time I saw Darla, it was photographs of her dead, decomposed body at the dump site where she was murdered and left by Robert Lee Yates.
Wow. Incredible connection. I had no idea. I knew you're from the area, but this is amazing.
I lived in the same city with him in Walla Walla. My daughter went to the same school with him. I knew two of his victims I had met personally. Another one was a graduate of my same high school, although much older than I. So I was familiar with not only the cities, but the people. And Arthur, may his soul rest in peace, he died he had a stroke and a heart attack or whatever. He helped me with actually the writing of the book, put me in touch with a lot of the people I interviewed. And he gave me an extensive interviews for the book about Darla. He actually saw Yates come and pick her up on their final date. Her body was found wearing his Mickey Mouse sweatshirt that he had lent her that day.
Wow.
So I knew these people. And it was because I knew the people. I had interacted.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. On August 26, 1997, the half-naked body of prostitute Heather Hernandez, 20, was found in an empty lot in Spokane, Washington. The same day, the decomposed corpse of prostitute Jennifer Joseph, 16, was discovered in an alfalfa field. Both women had been shot in the head. The day after Christmas, 4 more women were found with plastic bags tied over their heads, the gruesome signature of a killer who had sexually violated each one of them after they had died. And then there were more victims. When the killer is finally arrested, it turns out to be a devoted husband, a father of 5, a National Guard helicopter pilot, and a Desert Storm veteran. Not since the Green River Killer had the Pacific Northwest been so terrified by so savage a serial killer. Robert Lee Yates Jr. confesses to 15 murders. My guest is Edgar award-winning author Burl discussing Body Count, the terrifying true story of the Spokane Serial Killer. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview this evening, Burl.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and for your future information, the town is called Spokane.
Ah, Spokane. Thank you very much for correcting me on that.
It looks like it's Spokane, but it's actually pronounced Spokane. A lovely town in eastern Washington. And, I almost didn't write the book. There were about 13 other authors vying to do the story of Robert Lee Yates. And actually, there was another book called Murder in Spokane by Mark Furman, which I've never met Mr. Furman, but allow me to tell years later, 25, 30 years later, when Yates confessed that murder was cleared up as well. They were friends of my family. In fact, his brother, years later, long before the Spokane serial killer became well known, was a frequent guest in my home. And so there was a connection there. And then one of the murder victims, Darla, who is mentioned, and her boyfriend, Arthur. Arthur and I became friends in Seattle when he was managing an apartment building. He moved back to Spokane, and I had friends and relatives in Spokane. My family went there for Bloomsday. My son ran in the Bloomsday Marathon race. And on that day, I stopped by to visit Arthur, and his then current girlfriend, Darla, dropped by. A very attractive young lady, wearing very short cut-off jeans and obviously no underpants. And she proceeded to relate the fact that she just robbed somebody of $600. I said, Darla, what are you talking about? Turns out Darla was, I almost Freudian slip there, dollar and Darla. She was what we call in the polite vernacular a $20 whore. She worked the streets. But she happened to meet a very polite gentleman, traveling salesman, who offered her $600 to spend the weekend with him in the finest hotel in Spokane. And he would do that, I believe, twice a month, regular as clockwork. She would be safe. She'd be well fed. She'd be with a safe person. And like many people in that lifestyle, unable to look at it, that despite there were other authors who wanted to do the book, the publisher said, "Hey, you're obviously the guy."
Right. Now, what was the community like? You say it's a little sleepy little place, but what is Spokane like?
Well, Spokane is a bigger city than Walla Walla.
Right.
He was living in. He originally wasn't from Walla Walla. He was originally from, I believe, Oak Harbor, which is not too far from Mukilteo, where I was also living at the time I signed the contract to write the book. He was working in Walla Walla, Washington, ironically, as a prison guard, correctional officer. In fact, in the book, there's a photograph of Robert Lee Yates taken, his employee photo. They take the employee photo and the convict photos in the same place, just like the booking photos.
Yeah.
There's two photos of him in the book. One is his employee photo from the 1970s when he was there as a correctional officer, and then the photo of him as a prisoner in the 1990s after he was, found and confessed. So he wound up right back where he was before.
Ironic. Let's go back. You do, early on in the book, go back to Robert Yates, his life, his early life growing up. What were his parents like? Obviously, everybody wants to know what the upbringing and the life, so they can either draw some conclusions from that or not. But tell us about his early life growing up.
Okay. Now, he actually came from a wonderful family. He had great parents, and a lot of people just say the book is totally inaccurate. So
yeah,
I thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, that was going to be my first question, because I thought that was very intriguing that normally a publisher, Pinnacle, the true crime imprint of Kensington Press, had approached you rather than you approached them. And you said it was because you were familiar with the social and cultural makeup of the locales and your personal interaction with one or more of the principal characters central to the story. And yet you were and yet you said you were hesitant to write this book. Now, why were you hesitant to write this book, and explain the social and cultural makeup of the area in which this incredible story takes place?
Well, his very first victims, it turns out, were actually friends of my family. This goes back to Walla Walla, Washington, which is a sleepy town of about, officially 25,000. It's actually more than that. It's in the southeastern Washington tip. And Patrick Oliver, 21, and Susan Savage, 22, grew up together in Walla Walla, Washington. They'd been friends since childhood. They were both well-known people in the community. And the Oliver family and my family knew each other. And it's a close-knit town. And back in 75, on July 13th, they went out for picnics, said they'd be home in time for dinner, and they didn't come back. Their bodies were found in a recreational area 10 miles east of Walla Walla, in an area called Mill Creek, near a place called the Wickersham Bridge. It was a favorite outing spot for the Olivers. They were both found murdered, their bodies under an old tire and an old sleeping bag. The murder was never found. It wasn't